I don't know if you'd like to start with a quick description of life history interviews.
Okay, so I tend to use life history interviews in my own case, particularly to look at how people understand and behave in the political world as they see it. But generally, the methods of life history are focused on how people tell stories about their lives. And it's a broad church, really, because some people think, well, you need to start at the beginning and go to the end, or you can focus on a very sort of specific time period in people's lives. In my own case, I tend to go broadly over the whole life, but focusing on moments of political importance. There's, again, a broad church about how structured the questions are, should you have questions at all. Myself always have semi-structured questions there, so that they're not necessarily that you have to follow them, and you certainly don't have to follow them in order or replicate precise wording, but I like to have a pretty good idea about where I want to go. But there are some people who really just ask one question and then they let it run from there.
Tell me about your life.
The funny thing is, I originally trained in moral psychology and moral development, where it was very, very rigorous methodological training about what you could ask, how far out you could go from that. So when I went to do my PhD, I just swung the opposite way, and I started out by being extremely broad, like, tell me about your life or whatever. And I found that really didn't work for me because people needed guidance. They've had many experiences. So for me, I think that it's always been a question of finding the right balance given what it is that you are interested in. But really focusing on the stories that somebody tells about their life, looking at the intersection between their biography, but trying to map that onto verifiable historical events.
The method I'm more used to using, which is imagined futures essay writing, where generally young people are asked to imagine that they're older and telling somebody about what has happened in their life. So it's what they're kind of anticipating being the main things that will be there in the story of their lives that they've yet to have. And it's been used quite often around the point at which people leave education and go into the labour market, so transition from school to work. But it has been used in other contexts too, so it can be younger children talking about what they think their life will be like when they're 25. But there's no reason why it couldn't be used in other kind of contexts. So though I'm now in my 50s, might well be asked, how do I imagine my future and the process of aging and so on. But it's a little different from what you're describing because it's a task that's given, it's a instruction to write an essay about what sorts of things you'll be telling people about what's happened in your life.
Part of what I do is try to look at how people reimagine their pasts as well.
Yep.
And trying to actually regard the present circumstances as having been at one time one of several possible alternatives. So it is really about a reimagining of the past, but also, of course, in terms of political work, it does very much map also to, I think, reimagining a different kind of future as well.
In thinking about imagining our futures, you're necessarily talking about different things that might happen, all sorts of areas for different routes and unpredictability and so on. But I think, having read your book, I now appreciate that there's a closer affiliation between the two methods because people are looking back at their lives and thinking about not only what did happen, but also what might have happened.
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the points that I tried to make in the beginning of the book is what kind of imagination I'm talking about. Because imagination is often talked about as if it's just fanciful and doesn't bear a lot of connection to reason and indeed to reality. And then trying to project onto that map something more or less reasonable that could happen.
Yeah.
It is unpredictable because always there is the element of fate, but it also has a strong connection to the current understanding of the framework of the life as it is being lived.
In the essays, as these young people are talking about what they think might happen in their lives, there are all sorts of sudden changes, and it's kind of reminded me of the game of snakes and ladders, whereby you're playing the board and you're throwing the dice. You land on one square and suddenly you're up 2 rows on the board. And in some of the essays, an example of a ladder would be where I was offered this fantastic job. But there also, in these essays, there are bad things that happen in people's lives, and that might be, and then out of nowhere, illness struck my family or something. So, so I'm kind of thinking that as I'm reading these essays, we've got, and I've got a little snake here, or rather a big snake actually, but it's not real, and also, a ladder. and that these narratives are full of these points at which people say, and then this happened. And I think that's kind of quite interesting, the way in which these young people write about them, because they do just come out of nowhere in the story. There's not a sort of build up to it. Do you get the equivalent to snakes and ladders in your
Okay,
in your
now
story?
this is really interesting, because to me the ladder is one step at a time.
Oh, okay.
And it's actually moving in a particular direction, but it's step by step.
Oh, okay.
But I think the idea of acknowledging the role of fate, as it were, is very important. The whole...
It's kind of the roll of the dice in the game, and if we're thinking about where the elements of people's stories come from, maybe all those games that we play, they feed into this process of how we make sense of our lives.
For me, I've always been very taken with the Aldous Huxley quote, "Experience is not what happens to you, it's what you make of what happens to you." And the people who I tend to have in my studies, they are working within very well thought out political frameworks. And perhaps I don't spend enough time talking with them about things about fate, but because they are really activists first and foremost, and so they are about strategy and about trying to get from here to a hoped for, imagined future. It's trying to create a plan that can somehow take account of fate, but that nonetheless will move in a predictable way.
So if someone said to you about your method, what is it that you're getting at in using this method? Would it be something along the lines of what Jane Elliott has said about these Imagine Futures essays, which is these essays provide insights into people's understandings of the social world and their place within it. So these essays are a way of getting to see the world from the point of view of the people that we're asking to write essays, or in your case, be interviewed.
That is a quote which could absolutely be said to describe my work as well. I think that it is a wonderful prism from which to try to understand wider social questions. But I'm never personally interested in an individual life just as an individual life. So I'm going to get one of my props out. This is a photograph which I took in New York City in about 2003. I was standing at a crosswalk, and this is the base of a lamppost. It's at the very bottom of the lamppost, and as you can see, it's lots of small tiles, and this is a few blocks from the World Trade Center.
Right, yep.
And I was really taken with this because it was very small and very subtle, and probably was unnoticed by many people, and yet somebody made a huge effort to make this. And part of me thinking about research methods, I thought this is really interesting because it's many small, discrete pieces of different colors and different shapes, and they're very irregular, and some of them are mirrors and some of them are just black. And yet, if you stand back from it, you can actually see this writing, "A Nation Once Again." I'm interested in politics and everyday life, but I'm also interested in how the small pieces come together to give you a wider picture.
And just 4 words can convey so much. But I think one of the things that ties in with is your part in that story makes sense too. And I guess in your interviews, you find people bringing out photographs or bringing out little objects and saying, here is my bit of the Berlin Wall or whatever it is, and how this is significant.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, one of the things which is difficult, you don't always know when you first see something what the message is there.
And as you're speaking, I'm thinking maybe one difference between our methods is that we have looked at these essays, and we're talking about each time collecting maybe over 100, so quite a large, enough to be able to put some figures onto some things and to say in 1978 this many of the essay writers talked about going to university or getting married, and in 2009-10 this many did, and you can kind of get a sense of. They're not representative statistics, it's not a representative sample, but it is something that you can kind of get a quantification on. If everybody is telling you such individual stories, it's probably much harder for you to see any way in which numbers might come into your analysis.
Trying to understand the wide range of things that I've heard in terms of numbers actually depletes it of what really gives it its strength.
Yep.
It's not that you couldn't do, but I don't think that would be the best way to do it.
Yeah. And finding the equivalent of everybody's story would be stretching stretching the material, wouldn't it?
What is true is that any situation that I would go into to interview people, I would have spent a huge amount of time reading history. But that's true across the board, so that they don't feel that I've just come in and don't really know what I'm talking about.
And I guess that does bring us on to this question about kind of practical value, about why do we do this and what's the impact of doing this. And I'm thinking these are both methods that give us a window on how people think, so that can quite often be surprising. An example of that from the essays, when I was looking at those, made me very aware that 16-year-olds have a very different view of what it's like to be my age. Yes. And so in one of these essays, they're giving their narrative of what's going to be happening in their lives. And then I reached 50 and I was old and my life was over and I went into an old folks home, and I was thinking, this is wrong on so many levels. But it also, reminded me that the world does look very different when you're 16.
Yes.
And so my next prop is a pair of binoculars, because for a 16-year-old to realize that life is not over when you're 50, they need to step outside of their immediate circumstance and get a closer view of this thing that's really in the distance. And when people ask, what's the practical value of getting young people to write their imagined futures? My answer would partly be, well, it reminds us that the world looks very different when you're 16. So what would your answer be to, what's the practical value, or what's the
I brought this time dial. Have you seen these before?
Yes, yeah.
Which I really love. You can figure out 1962 was March 24th, a Thursday or whatever. Yeah. And you can go into the past and way into the future. It's about a two-way movement of time, really. So I would say sort of looking through both ends of those binoculars, because one of the things I'm also very interested in is intergenerational communication.
Yep.
Not only how we look at our future selves and also people who are older than us, but indeed how we integrate our ideas of who we have been as well. There is a huge strength to be drawn from this intergenerational communication. And I think it's not just about getting a sense of how people see and understand the political world, but it's also getting a sense of history and a sense of future. Cross-generational binding, but also through time. So to me, that is a deeply hopeful kind of trajectory.
The community partner we work with on the Isle of Sheppey, which is quite a deprived context, it's not an affluent area, and Jenny really wants those young people that she comes into contact with to be proud about where they come from. So my third one is a photograph of one of the early aeroplane pioneers. So this is Claude Brabazon, who was on the Isle of Sheppey, and he's got this contraption and it's looking weird to the people, and someone in the crowd says pigs might fly. He's got this ambition to get this contraption up in the air. So it's a picture of the pig that he then got and put in this little wicker basket and made a sign saying, I'm the first pig to fly.
That's
and
great.
So the first pig to fly was on the Isle of Sheppey. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because, he had this sort of aspiration, he had this hope, he had this idea, this ambition. So she's using these types of activities to get people to be proud of where they are, to be kind of thinking positively about what they might do in their lives.
This brings me to my third and final prop. Okay, so I have this little conch shell here, and then I have a portion of a conch shell. So this is meant in its crude sense to represent our attempts to listen, that there's something about a distorted sound in there and we can nearly access it, etc. But the thing about this is that it looks really whole, and it's unusually whole. But I think I chose this one really because I think this is more like what really happens.
Yep.
We try to listen and we do our best, but we can only access part of someone's experience. And we don't necessarily know, as we don't know here, what we're not hearing.
Yeah.
You are you.
Yeah.
And sometimes you won't be able to hear what people are actually trying to say to you because it's so distant far. And one of the things about the student population that I teach is they tend to come from very socially excluded, marginalized places, and they have a wealth of experience, many things which are far away from the things that I grew up with and indeed that I have in my life. But if they realize that these life stories are of value themselves, and they bring them into the classroom, and those are the materials that we work with and that we teach with, it is really a potential space of real excitement. when they realize that their experiences and their stories that they come into the classroom with actually really matter, that they can count as something.
But the other thing that we found is that times move on, and so we were asking in 2009-10 young people to write an essay, and they said, what, on paper with a pen, you know, why don't we talk to the camera? Why don't we do Big Brother style? You know, why are you so locked in old technology? So, you know, maybe Imagine Futures essays, we need to be a bit more imaginative about the way we collect that material.
In a departmental meeting recently, we were talking about our students and their actual futures. I suggested that possibly in the first term when they arrive there, that they should write just a short piece about the person they hope to become as a result of embarking on this trajectory.
Yep. So if they imagine their future 3 years on at the start of their degree, and then at the end of their degree look back on that period, then actually what we've got is our two methods being used by the same people. Because I suppose our two methods do have this potential to be used together creatively.
Yes, and I think that spending a concentrated period of time trying to think about, when you say imagining futures, it's not only a hoped for future, it can also be a dreaded future. And so if we encourage our students and indeed ourselves to engage more in activities like that, I think that in the end, the result is more likely to be that we look back on a life or an experience that we find somehow approximating satisfaction. If you actually think about the life you hope you will look back on, you can actually do a lot more with it.
Yeah, and you've got a bit in your book about blueprints for successful aging, and I guess, you know, again, if we come back to what's the value of this, then actually the more we do these types of activities, interview people about their lives, encourage them to think about the future, then that can be a real practical benefit, because it helps us to get our bearings more in what can otherwise seem like a bewildering field of uncertainty about the future. Actually, we can say, you know, aging doesn't have to be something that is all necessarily negative and stuff to be anxious about. There are lots of blueprints of successful aging. I can't do better than your expression. So these two methods speaking to each other, there's a little bit of it going on already, but there's no reason why it couldn't grow from this.
Yes, I think there will be a lot of fruitful ways to put them in more actively in conversation over a period of time.
Yeah, let's hope this conversation continues.